land trusts. So just a brief overview of sort of like the main areas. I'll be talking about recruiting and formalizing membership. I'll be talking about the necessary steps for planning your first AGM and the actual process of electing your first elected board of directors. I'll also be talking about how to support the board and board style governance, policy-based governance, that transition from being an operating board to being a policy board will be the third major chunk. And then the last major chunk will be like everything you need to do to plan for that first paid staff and what that should look like. The two middle sections will be the largest sections. And I think if you guys have any questions, it would be, I don't want you to wait until the very, very end because that'll be a long time. So definitely near the end of each section, I'll try and make some space for questions. But if it looks like I've forgotten, sometimes I can just, steam right on ahead. And definitely please put up your hand when you feel we might be transitioning into a new section if you have a question about the previous one. Okay, let's go. So community-led governance, right? So you guys are all interested in the community land trust model. And that really means that your governance mechanism should be community-led. So that's why I'm leading with this slide, just to help us all to internalize a little bit what that means. Obviously, at the initial stages, your initial membership and board election process should be guided by community-led governance principles. So the people who first started the initiative, that those 3 or eventually 5 and then 7 people who say, oh yeah, this could really work. Our community really needs that. We call those initiative leaders, and you can and you should definitely take first crack at the purpose, the vision, and the values of the organization that you're trying to grow. But even at that stage, if possible, you should create opportunities for community feedback as early as possible. Having some open town hall style meetings to say, hey, this is what we're thinking of for our purpose, vision, and values. Stay tuned to this space. We're going to be creating an organization. If you have some feedback for us right now, let's hear it. And whatever other ways you can think of in your own particular communities to centralize as much as possible the voices of your other community members. There's a bit of a privilege to being sort of amongst that group of people who's really excited about a particular idea. And that's great because that energy is how things happen. But even at that stage, it's important to remember that ultimately your idea is for the benefit of the community, and if possible, you should find ways to make sure that the community has voices as early on as possible. So just a little bit about overall governance roles, even at the very beginning. Of course, there are members, there are directors, and there are officers, right? Community land trusts answer to their members. That's, the C in community land trusts is for community. And that means that there are certain principles like free and open membership, making certain that there aren't classes of members that have different rights or obligations within an organization, making certain that anyone who wants to participate in the democratic control of the organization has a pathway and the supports necessary in order to do so. Members are who elect your directors. And I will harp on this point a little bit. I might even sound like a broken record by the time I'm done, because this is really an important and key aspect, particularly of a community land trust, to never lose sight of. Especially early on when boards are a little bit more operational, a little bit more really invested in the day-to-day operations of the organization, boards can take on a certain atmosphere of sort of ownership of the governance process. And there's a pattern that can develop where the existing board members know that the AGM is up and coming. And so they go out and they find people in the community that they think might make good board members to take over from the handful of them who might have to retire at this AGM. And they kind of drive that process a little bit based on their particular viewpoint, their experiences on the board. And that, when problems do develop on boards, they tend to root at that particular point, and losing sight of the fact that directors should always be an expression or an articulation of the interest in the organization of the members. So like organizations will have nominating committees, but the nominating committee will be all made up of board members. And that's actually, I think, not the best way to do it. I think nominating committees should be made up explicitly of committee and community members who are not board members, to make certain that the vetting process and the outreach process into the community looking for new directors is in fact driven by members and not sort of, accidentally influenced by the somewhat vested perspective of long-term board members. And of course, members also approve major decisions. Your bylaws can and should only delegate certain authorities to the board of directors, and they should withhold certain very major authorities to the members themselves, so that those decisions are made only at membership meetings. Those would be decisions like, selling affordable housing, housing that you might be holding in service of your membership, selling or changing the relationship of that housing to your membership. That would be a major decision that might be reserved from the board for members only. Directors, of course, are responsible for management and oversight. So everything that actually happens day to day, ultimately directors have responsibility on behalf of members to make certain that it happens well and that there is enough oversight in place to make certain that things that don't prejudice the interests of the community members in the property that's held in trust for everyone. Directors have a legal duty to act in the best interests of an organization. And again, directors are required to represent members' interests, not necessarily members' will, or not necessarily, what the result of the members' poll was. There's a very subtle area here in that when you're legally constituted as a trust, and you are acting as a director, that you represent the interests of the members. And you should certainly be sensitive. Obviously, self-determination is one key interest of community members, but having access to a resource, under whatever the fundamental terms that I see your question, Rose. I'll see to it when I get closer to the end of the section. The interests of members, say for instance that the community land trust you've organized is to provide affordable housing to a community, and there's a big important question about how to deal with a particular asset, and you recognize as directors that the members might want a certain project format, but you as directors understand that that particular project format might risk your ability to hold on to the property for the community's benefit in the long term. So then you have a particularly tough situation where you have to weigh members' interests to have access to the affordable housing, per the terms of your trust in perpetuity, versus perhaps their will right now, which might be to to have the project operating in a way that might risk it a little bit. So I just wanted to highlight that distinction, because the earlier on you build that distinction into your organizational culture, the less difficulty that you'll have. And then, of course, officers are appointed for specific functions. You'll always have a board chair, a secretary, and a treasurer. Some organizations also like to have a vice chair or vice president. And the executive director is also often appointed to be an officer. And so officers have certain capacities, in regard to the entire organization, sometimes singly, sometimes in pairs, depending on how your bylaws are written. Rose, what's your question?
So my question is about protecting assets long term. And you sort of kind of came close to this, but it centers around the definition of the member's interest. Mm-hmm. Because according to this experienced lawyer, members sometimes, want to take the assets for themselves, mm-hmm. In 30 years, let's say. Mm-hmm. And so maybe this is not the place to discuss it, but just the issue of their interests, versus the values and the purpose of the CLT.
Yeah. So the community land trust is a trust. That the T's there for a reason, which means that the trust, it will be settled with respect to a clearly defined membership. So almost always in the case of CLTs, it will be a geographically defined region, and everyone who is a community member within that region are the members, or it might be, you know, divided based on certain characteristics as well. But it is held in trust, and what that means in the case of CLT, unless it is explicitly written in the founding documents, it would be interpreted in the context of the mission, vision, and values. So that, you know, the same as if you, and you can use this example sometimes, it helps people to understand, same as if, you know, you were some really, really rich uncle, and in your will, you set up a trust for your niece for a certain purpose, to see to her education or to see that she had housing for the rest of her life. Those principles for which the trust was settled, you can't violate them in law. So whoever's executing that trust for you will be bound to that particular mission. And the board of directors is also bound, in the case of a CLT, to the particular mission that's articulated either in your founding documents or in your mission, vision, and values. I think that probably gives you enough guidance to help distinguish between those two drives. Okay, let's move on to the next one, membership choices. So there are lots of different places to go here. You know, organizations can have voting and non-voting members, but community land trusts, of course, you know, are supposed to have free and open membership. We, by default, think it doesn't make sense to have non-voting members, but there are a couple of classes where it does sometimes make sense. So, for instance, sometimes it's important, or it feels important in your community to involve young people who are like under the age of 16. And then you can, in fact, have a youth membership class if you want, in order to encourage people's interests, make it meaningful that they're joining something, make it so that they can, in fact, participate on committees and things like that. But just recognizing that they're not quite, it might in your community not quite be ready time for them to be able to vote. Or another class that sometimes is spoken about, of course, are supporting members. So that would be people who support the mission and vision and values of your particular community land trust, but don't live within the geographical confines of your organization, and therefore, you know, don't really have the same community-based vested interest, but they do support you. So they can also be a non-voting member class. Staff is also another example that in some cases might be put forward as you know, a non-voting membership class, to make certain that they do have rights around participation. You know, the right to attend AGMs and to voice their opinion, but not necessarily the right to vote. Open membership, of course, is definitely the most accessible, but it also can be unwieldy. So again, depending on your structure, you can make some trade-offs in this area. But within the CLT model, it's of course very difficult, because that free and open membership is a very, very core principle. But if you're talking about something like one specific building with very specific residents, then, you know, there might be reasons to still structure as a trust, but having a less open membership. And then there's multi-stakeholder membership, right? This, of course, is much more applicable to other types of not-for-profits, but it can be, you know, useful in this model as well. For instance, the Parton Neighborhood Land Trust does have two stakeholder membership classes. It has people who actually live and work in the buildings that are held in trust, and then it has people who are just community members in the community for which the housing is you know, held in trust for. And they do have slightly different vested interests, and there is value to articulating those perspectives separately. And so the PLT does have a multi-stakeholder membership model for that purpose. Okay, so building membership, very important part, of course. And really the most important aspect here is just getting yourself in front of people, preferably in person, but online as well, regular events that can, at least in part, be membership drives is definitely the way to go. You can relatively easily find funding to support regular events, like even farmers markets, crafts fairs, seed exchanges, things like that. Different municipalities will have grants to support that. Different arts council type grants can be found to support these types of activities. And as an aside, these events can be used to raise awareness of a particular initiative and actually act as membership drives, or you can be in front of people saying, hey, we're creating this new community land trust. We want to collect members' names and make certain that you're informed when we have our first annual general meeting, things like that. The West End Food Co-op here in Parkdale about 10 years ago was created like this. We just got a grant to start a farmers market and ran that farmers market for the summer. The farmers market kind of paid for itself with the grant and the fees from the farmers. We were even able to hire a staff person to make certain it was coordinated. But at the end of this, over the course of summer, we went from the 12 people who had been really interested in organizing this initiative to 1,400 members just by the end of the summer, strictly on the basis of being able to be in front of people at a repeating event like that. So tables literally on the corner that pop up every Tuesday and Thursday when the day school is getting out, or when on Friday evenings when people are moving around the community a little bit more with some regularity, every week during the summer at the same time, is another great way to actually get your message in front of people. Sometimes people will, they won't engage until the third or fourth time they've seen you in their community, and then they recognize, oh yeah, there's actually something going on. These people have a sense of commitment. I'll take a minute because I'm curious about what's going on. It's a really great way to connect with people, but regularity is definitely the key. Social media and a website, of course, are another great way to spread the word. It's important to, of course, you have to keep accurate membership records. Having your purpose, vision, and values, and any particular highlights of your bylaws, like whether you're going to be multi-stakeholder member type membership or things like that. It is really good to have that information available as you're starting to do the membership drive, because people will want to know that you've thought about these things, and they'll want at least some of their questions about sort of where you're headed a little bit more than, oh, we want to turn that building into affordable housing. They'll want a little bit more than that. And yes, keeping accurate membership records is definitely going to be key when it comes around to your annual general meeting. You don't necessarily need to collect a membership fee, but some organizations do at the early stage. It can go either way. It demonstrates a degree of commitment on the part of community members if they're willing to give you a $5 membership fee. But it can be a barrier if you don't have some kind of support program for whom that is in fact a barrier. So keep that in mind. But definitely everyone's names and some kind of contact are crucial. Now that initial little stage of board building, I'll get into much more detail about boards later on, but this is just that initial board, right? So the people who initially got the initiative off the ground and signed the articles of incorporation, usually there will be some kind of other organizational support in the community, like maybe a community health center or some other support agency really understands the need for affordable housing in your community, and so they are low-key supporting the creation of the new organization. Often such a supporting organization will provide a couple of community board members as well. And so that's usually the first board is comprised of those people who actually sign the articles of incorporation, and one or two others that are added to support. This initial board will perforce be an operating board responsible for making all of the operational decisions for the new organization until an elected board has come along after your first AGM and staff has been hired to take over day-to-day activities. And that operational board is just being set up in contrast to a policy board, which I'll describe later on, like the sort of the end game for the beginning arc from the perspective of a board of directors is to start off as an operational board and end up as a policy board. Of course, the purpose of this initial board is to develop all the appropriate bylaws, make the initial corporate decisions. Like obviously you need to have a bank account. Quite likely if your initiative is if you're likely responding to some proximate initiative in your community, and you probably will be, that initial board will be starting negotiations with community partners or organizational funders, getting some seed grant from CMHC or various things like that. So that initial board will have to be comprised of people who are willing to contribute a considerable amount of time. In the long term, board members are usually thinking they're going to be on the hook for one board meeting, one committee meeting, and maybe 3 hours of work outside of that a month. But initially, sometimes operational boards in the first few months meet almost every week or every week for some periods if they're in the middle of negotiations or things like that. So it's a considerably larger degree of effort. So it's important to make certain that you know and understand that at the outset. And when you're looking for those first few people to sign on to your articles of incorporation and thereby effectively become your first board, it's important to recognize that they will be putting in a considerable more time and effort than people will later on. So your initial bylaws is another really critical part. They're very important because they set the terms of membership in the organization. So CLT membership must be free and open, but as I mentioned before, it can have identified stakeholder groups and non-voting members. And the board membership, of course, has to be determined, the length of terms, whether you want 2-year terms or 3-year terms, whether you want people to have 2 consecutive terms or 3 consecutive terms before they have to not be on the board at least for 1 cycle. What size of board you want, there's a lot to kind of go into there. If you have a community that is very vibrant, a very sort of activist-based initiative, then you probably want a larger board, up to even 15 people, 15, 18 people is probably getting to be about the max, where you are definitely representing a diverse set of community interests, and you're recognizing that part of the purpose of the board is to actually have the community-based discussions that you need in order to, one moment. In order to articulate what your community's genuine interests are. But if you do have a specific project already in mind, it's not going to be controversial. You're just taking over a particular building because your community has a very acute need for housing for women-led families. And it's important to the community that happen quickly. That initial board is going to, the board is going to be doing a lot of work initially. Then you might want to have a smaller board, 6 or 8 people, because that kind of a board can operate a little bit more efficiently in making quick decisions, negotiating with funders and things like that. So all of those details do need to be clarified in your bylaws before you have your first AGM. They don't need to be determined at the point that you incorporate, but the process of writing out your bylaws is a very key aspect of that initial board, and you have to make certain that you do your best to get it right for your organization. One very key point for long-term board health, and this is a bit of a, kind of a, I wouldn't say sticky or controversial issue, but it's an issue that people don't like to think about, because ultimately this issue is about, this particular issue I'm going to take up now is about conflict that may arise in the community or on the board. And that does happen sometimes. And the absolute worst thing is when conflict or real difficulties arise and you don't have ways to deal with it, because then the organization is paralyzed, and the issue has to really, really blow up out of hand and start to involve the membership generally, which means it's therefore also involving the community generally. And if you have appropriate aspects in place, then you can manage these situations more carefully. One of the key things is that boards often cannot remove uncooperative board members. Only members can do so. From the perspective of most not-for-profit corporate legislation in Canada, like the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act and most other such acts are similar. Because the right to remove board members who are representatives of the members should be reserved to the members that to articulate their democratic interests. But those types of meetings tend to be very stressful and divisive not only for the organization, but for the community as a whole. However, bylaws can require that board members be members of the organization, and bylaws can delegate the members' authority to the board to expel members for not meeting membership criteria. So if the bylaws clearly state that members must support the purpose and values of the organization, and if those values include inclusiveness, collaborative decision-making, non-discrimination, and things like that, then it is possible for boards to remove an uncooperative or deeply divisive board member simply by revoking their membership. But the members do have to make that explicit step of delegating both the authority to expel members to the board and recognizing that membership in the organization does require upholding certain values. And if they have articulated both those, then you can, in fact, remove board members that are causing real difficulties for the organization. So as I say, a bit of a difficult topic, but it really is worth setting in place early. And I'll make another note about the other similar thing around a conflict resolution policy later on as well. Safeguarding yourself against when things go wrong is a really, really healthy thing to do when you're first setting things up. So recruiting board nominees. Of course, community partners is a great place. Staff, board and committee members of other community partner organizations that are goal aligned with yours. They're a great source for board nominees. It's really nice to have one or two board members who actually have sat on other boards as well. And this is a great way to get them, especially if you're partnering with an organization. At first, it might seem a little bit like there might be a conflict in having a board member from an organization that you're partnering in. But the board member must also be a member of your organization. And that board member, as an experienced board member, actually should have a well-articulated understanding that when they're a board member for your organization, that their role is to represent the interests of your members. And the other thing that an experienced board member should recognize is that that you really do have an obligation as a board member to lead with your knowledge and your understanding of a situation. So the most important thing a board member can bring to an organization is their knowledge and understanding in service of the members of your organization. So the knowledge and understanding of a community partner is actually really, really valuable to your organization. And so you shouldn't be afraid of including that perspective. You might want to have that discussion and assure yourself that they do in fact really truly understand what it means to be a board member, but it's not inherently a conflict. Community engagement, of course, once you have made your initial planning for your AGM, and you have some members that you have been doing the membership drive for a while, then it's time to look for potential board nominees, because you do want to lead with this activity as much as possible. It can take 3 months really to sort of get the word out into the community that you're looking for board members, have those conversations with people, sort of you vet through the ones that might not be the best at working with others and so forth. Where can you find them? Faith-based communities. If you can go and make a presentation at some local faith-based communities that have the values aligned, you can often find interested people who actually have time to volunteer. So definitely it's a great way of finding people. Your initial board members can, of course, stand for election at the first AGM, and for continuity, definitely some should. However, returning board members should not be treated any differently than new board nominees. So if you are, your initial board members, usually if your bylaws say you have staggered terms, then the board members initially decide who's going to have like a 1-year term or who's going to have a 2-year term, to make certain that the whole board doesn't resign at once, because it is one of the ways you maintain the interests of your members is by ensuring that your board does have some continuity of vision and perspective based on not having all of the board members replaced at one time. However, those returning board members whose term may have ended, but they wish to have a second term on the board, even if they're the initial board members, should not be treated any differently than new board nominees that are coming through the election process. Those initial board members are not absolutely required to resign and stand for election at the first AGM, unless the bylaws require it. But community democracy principles do strongly argue for your board members to have the legitimacy of election at a open AGM as early as possible. So diversity and meaningful choice, these are also really important to strive for. Everyone's community is different, but everyone's community has some level of diversity, however that's measured in your community. And it's really important to ensure that your nominees fully represent that diversity as much as possible. And it's also important to ensure that members have a meaningful choice during their first AGM. So if your board has 6 spots available, it's not really a meaningful choice if you only provide the members 6 people to choose from, because they're not really being chosen. It's sort of not really meaningful if you're only providing them 7 or 8 people to choose from. And it's also actually a little bit kind of hard on the 1 or 2 people who don't get elected, if you only are providing 7 or 8 choices to fill 6 seats. But if you're providing 9 or 10 choices or even 12 choices, then you are providing a meaningful choice to your membership. And the people who don't make the cut, they have a little bit of a soft landing as well. And I know that this is all, like, finding board nominees is hard work, to be honest. But it's absolutely critical to a healthy board. Yes, Elliot?
Thanks. This is great. I just had a question about possible, like, what your thoughts are around compensation for board members. And I'm particularly thinking about, in terms of trying to reflect diversity, just how challenging it can be for those with lived experience of poverty to participate in these environments, and thinking about like practices around like paying a living wage or covering childcare or other forms of just providing support so that it can be inclusive. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so you can't, unfortunately, for not-for-profit boards, you can't actually compensate people specifically for their time at board meetings, but there are other things that you can do. Usually what you do is you create an accommodation policy for volunteers generally, and then you include in it things like phone allowances, or internet connectivity allowances. You provide meal vouchers, for people, make certain that they have, support that way. Daycare vouchers or daycare support for your meetings. So there are lots of ways that you can eliminate those barriers, and you should feel quite free to go quite as deep on that as you want. All it does is strengthen your organization, and it generates actually a tremendous amount of trust in your community for your organization. If your community sees that you're doing everything you can to reduce the barriers for participation for others. But you can't actually do, like, even an honorarium for board members specifically is not allowable. So you have to make certain that it's clearly couched in terms of minimizing those barriers. And then you don't have to choose, if you're going to give people a phone allowance, it doesn't have to be the absolute bare minimum $40. It can be a reasonably larger than that. And it still counts as an expense for the organization and doesn't run afoul of the honorarium restrictions. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, here we go. Your first AGM. A big day indeed. So you're required to have your first AGM, some, depending on your provincial legislation specifically, it might be 3 or 4 or even 6 months after the end of your first fiscal year, but you will have to have it with some relatively short period after the end of your first fiscal year. Your first fiscal year, there's some leeway too, like you don't have to necessarily define it at the very beginning. So you can like just sort of any time within the first 12 months, you can that initial board can just make a motion to determine what the fiscal year is, register that change with your regulatory body. And then it will be, your first AGM will have to be measured with respect to that. But that's ultimately what that first clock is, because you know, your role as a board is to provide oversight for how the organization is operating, and that's articulated through those financial statements that you're ultimately going to have audited and then presented to the members at the first AGM for their acceptance. The first AGM should formally adopt the bylaws and elect the new board of directors. And if the first fiscal year has ended, also accept the auditor's report and appoint an auditor for the following year. So if you are, you can have your first AGM before the end of your first fiscal year. And if that's the case, then you don't need to accept an auditor's report, but you will need to appoint an auditor for when they are appointed. So the bylaws, just one sort of subtle thing there to be clear, because it can be a little bit tricky. Once the initial board is created and it has drafted some bylaws, then that board can, by its own motion, bring those bylaws into effect. And so say they determine membership classes, or they say it determines the quorum for a members meeting and so forth. All of those provisions will apply just based on the board's acceptance until the first members meeting after that point, at which either the bylaws will be adopted by the members and the members will agree to all of those terms, or maybe they won't be. And if they aren't, then the bylaws stop operating at that point when the members reject them, and then you go back to whatever the provisions of your act are, until the board then proposes new bylaws. The board won't be able to re-propose the same controversial issues that failed the first time, or it can re-propose them, but they won't automatically come into effect. So basically, if the membership has explicitly or implicitly said no to certain bylaw provisions, then they can't come into effect again until the membership has said yes to them. So this is also the case if later on in your organization's life cycle, you need to change the bylaws again. Again, it's initiated usually by the governance committee and then recommended to the board, and the board will approve them and recommend to the membership. And those changes in the bylaws do take effect when the board recommends them to the membership, but only up until the point at which the membership approves them. If the membership doesn't approve them, then they cease to be in effect. Things go back to the way they were. In the case of your first AGM, they go back to whatever your governing legislation says they are. In the case of successive modifications to your bylaws, they go back to what the previous revision of the bylaws was, unless and until the membership approves them. So the first AGM should also be viewed as a prime opportunity to raise awareness of what the organization is doing and to build a sense of participation and ownership. So it's a really great opportunity to, I don't know, I imagine maybe there's a plot of land that your organization has been gifted. And this is really an opportunity to make some noise about, let's have a community, garden party to like clean up this plot of land and turn it into a garden for the next 2 years while we do the fundraising necessary to build some affordable housing on it. Anything that people can actually do and participate in is really good to have as part of the first AGM to help build that sense of excitement and community ownership. Some kind of visual report on your activities, or 1 or 2 feedback activities. So like, maybe you have your sights on a particular building, but you haven't decided whether that building is maybe it should be specifically targeted to supporting women-led families, or specifically targeted to supporting urban indigenous families, whatever might, and the initial organizers might not have made that decision. If at your first AGM, you can actually get a feedback and direction from the members on questions like that, again, that meaningfully impacts the organization's activities and really gives people a sense of actually belonging to something that means something. And of course, for your first AGM, the accurate membership records that you took when you're doing your membership drive are really the only way that you'll have to be able to ensure that only members vote at the AGM. And so that's why it is important. Really the only mechanism you'll have for determining who can participate in those decisions is your membership list. So don't lose track of it. Okay, so so adopting the bylaws at the AGM, what does that actually mean? It is definitely important to have someone present who can clearly explain the bylaw provisions in case there are questions. So you might have, like, if I was one of your board members, then you'd be okay. And then some organizations do have, board members who are just, they might be lawyers, or they might just be, eager beavers that are really into that kind of detail. But you do have to make certain that you have someone present who does feel comfortable explaining the specifics and the mechanics of what the bylaw provisions mean, because it's really fundamental. The people making the decision, the members, you can't really expect them to understand what quorum means, why it's important, why that number is so low when there's 85 people in this building right now. Why are we setting the quorum down for members' meetings to 15? Different things like that. It's important to have someone there who can meaningfully respond to community members' quite legitimate concerns about what these provisions that they're about to sign off are. And it can be okay to rely on an outside expert for this. That expert should be able to present the highlights of the bylaws and also explain to the members their role in the overall governance, and particularly the members' rights. Right, that's the part that specifically should be accentuated. The right to appoint an author, the right to elect a board of directors, the right to call a members' meeting to amend the bylaws, just entirely on the say-so of the members. It's important for members to understand in most jurisdictions that they do in fact have the right to force a members' meeting to be called to consider bylaw changes that the members themselves feel are important, even if they don't have the support of the directors. It's hard to do, but sometimes it's necessary. We did have a case here in Parkdale not too long ago where I did support the membership of an organization, of a not-for-profit, in going through that very difficult process where their board of directors just was quite disconnected from the needs and interests of the membership, and they needed to really enforce some changes. Adopting the bylaws, of course, formally requires a formal motion. You have to record the person who moved the motion and record who seconded it. And again, another kind of subtlety is that if it includes changes to the membership provisions, or it includes changes to how property is disposed on the windup of the organization, or otherwise impacts how property can be disposed of, which I eliminated here because that shouldn't really be a provision for a land trust, then you need to have a 2/3 majority of the members present vote in favor of the bylaws. But if neither of those is the case, if you simply have flat open membership, or if your provisions for the disposal of property aren't specified in the bylaws and they're simply whatever they are in the articles of incorporation, then a simple majority will suffice to pass the bylaws. And the same is true for any future amendments to the bylaws. If it touches on membership, or if it touches on ultimate disposition of property, then to adopt those bylaw changes, you'll need to have a 2/3 majority of the membership. But otherwise, a simple majority will pass. I have 4 little notifications here, so you people were just chatting. So I'm just catching up on your messages here. if a bylaw proposal fails and there's a time limitation on reproposing, how can you tell if a subsequent proposal is substantially the same as a failed proposal? So those types of provisions are, you do your best, and the board is allowed to do its best, acting in the best interest of the organization. Ultimately, if things got really, really hairy and you had to have things ended up in front of a judge or something like that, the judge is not going to censor you for doing your best. So long as you're defensively doing your best to answer those questions, you'll be okay. So you don't need to worry. Just try to answer the question honestly and just pretend that you're going to be defending your analysis to objective people. And thanks, Cindy, that's right. Depending on your jurisdiction, there will be a slightly different number, but yeah, until your statements exceed a certain amount, you won't need to have them audited. Yes, and you're right, Cindy, with respect to the membership provisions in the ONCA. Correct. And further down, things are a little bit different provincially or federally, depending on what your jurisdiction is. So it is important. Like, you can't really get this far without having some kind of legal advice. So definitely you should have some kind of not-for-profit aware lawyer make certain that he or she is guiding you on the fine points of those particularities. Yeah. Okay. If there are no other questions, I am going to move on. Okay, so how to run an election if you have an in-person ballot. The usual process, this is for in-person. The next slide I'll do if you're going to have some kind of online remote election. You appoint a returning officer to oversee the balloting and counting process. The usual process to hand ballots out while the membership is being checked as people arrive. So non-members, should be, and it is true, if you're trying to develop interest and excitement in your community, your first AGM should be open to the public, open to community members and anyone else who's interested, but you still have to be very careful to determine who is in fact a member, who's on your membership list and who isn't. And those who are on your membership list, you can give them a printed ballot at that point. It's great to have nominees give remarks in person, but to be honest, it is a little bit smoother to record nominee statements ahead of time, because almost always you'll have one or two nominees who aren't able to be present for the AGM, and so it's great to have everyone sort of on the same level by having them all have recorded video statements that you present to everyone. Make sure there is clarity on how to break a tie. It actually happens. The usual way is to draw lots, but a lot of people don't even know what the exact process for how to do that. So someone should put some thinking in to how to actually break a tie if it should have managed to happen during your first election. And then announce the results, and of course remember to thank all of the nominees. It did take some courage and willingness to contribute to community to even stand for an election, so that should be respected. And then it's usually good to have a formal motion to accept the election results and to destroy the ballots. That's just tidy. The ballots shouldn't be kept around because they are it's just asking for trouble. So once you have had that motion and the members have agreed in person to accept the results, they no longer have a purpose, and you can make certain that they destroy securely. Any questions about in-person elections? Good. Online ballots. So you can when you're, of course, designing an online ballot form, it's good to have one that includes the written or video statements by the nominees. Again, I definitely prefer, it's not too hard these days with Zoom to hop on a Zoom meeting with each of the nominees and record it, and then edit them all together into into a quick little video clip. Again, you have to ensure that the filled out ballot forms match the membership records and that there are no duplicate forms. It's fine to use an automatic ballot tally system. For instance, Google Forms. It's pretty easy to get Google Forms to dump ballots into a spreadsheet, and then for that spreadsheet to have another tab that actually searches for provisional ballots and highlights them, and another tab that then collates the results, so that you basically have sort of real-time assessment of the results, and you just have to ensure that someone has gone and done the physical check of the ballots to make certain that everyone who submitted the ballot is in fact a member. If you're doing that, it's often you want to encourage in-person AGM participants to say and remind everyone as they arrive, oh yeah, we're doing our election online. So if you do want to vote, make certain you do it, before this point in the meeting, on your own phone or device. And they can still participate at that point, but you have to set a very clearly defined time at which you're no longer going to accept results, and you have to have determined that time at the beginning of your process. So it must be clear. When you create the form, it should say very clearly when ballots will be accepted until such and such time during the AGM. Or you might not want to go there at all and just have ballots accepted until midnight the day before the AGM. It's up to you. Some jurisdictions, of course, may or may not allow this process. You'll have to get advice on your specific jurisdiction. And then you, once you get to that portion of your meeting and there's been some time between the point at which the online ballot is closed and the final ballots have been checked and the results tallied, you announce the results and thank your nominees. And then again, you have a motion to accept the election results and destroy the ballot forms. You should not hold that form around either any more than you should hold around the paper results. Yes, Rose.
So I've been at AGMs where they've used different processes. So one example is, let's say there's 3 positions open and there's 6 candidates. You go through the candidates and you vote yay or nay for each one.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've been to other ones where, say it's the same configuration and then there's an online vote and you pick the top 3. Like, do you see any pros and cons? And there were very different processes in terms of, like, for instance, if you want anybody but that person, so like they're different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just wondering about your take on that.
I haven't seen an organization use a ranked ballot yet, but I do think you're welcome to. You're allowed to, so long as your bylaws articulate that. And I think it is a good idea. I think it does result in a better board that's more responsive to the diverse views of the membership. And it's relatively easy to explain to people how that is. Some people think ranked ballots are weird and mysterious, but at the end of the day, the people who succeed in a ranked ballot election are the people who, on average, showed up higher on the ballots of more people than the people who didn't. And the math behind that is complicated, but you just stick to your guns with that particular statement and eventually it sinks in. So yes, there you go. I do encourage.
Thank you.
There's a couple other questions here. Online vote. Oh, that was your question, Rose. Thank you. And yes, proxies are definitely trickier. And I do suggest that you have if you do allow for proxy provisions, that you tie it to some aspect of your vision and values specifically, because it is just harder, and there tend to be a little bit more mistakes around that sort of second level of qualification. So again, so long as you have a clear reason for doing so, then you can always fall back on, this is what we were trying to do, and this is why it's important. And that helps to smooth through those difficult situations as they arise. I'm gonna answer this other question in the chat, and then I'll ask you, Maria, your question. So it's just another moment. So can you invite non-voting members to monthly board meetings? Absolutely. I think it's a very healthy thing to do. I think it's a very healthy thing to make certain that you have some staff representation once you have staff just in the room at board meetings. And then the only slight fly in that ointment is that ultimately there are things that certain topics that a board does have to consider confidentially. Those would usually be staffing issues, HR issues, and certain aspects of critical negotiations. Like when you're literally in the process of negotiating an agreement of purchase and sale, those types of things do have to happen in private because you don't, you can't. It's the same as an individual having to be able to hold their conscience when they're making a complicated decision. The board as a whole has to be able to hold its conscience during negotiations. And so those portions of board meetings should be kept in camera. But outside of that, yes, definitely the more people who are there aware of what's going on and recognizing that the board and the organization is not at all afraid of having people know what's going on, definitely builds a sense of community and general ownership. Maria? Your turn, Maria. You're muted if you're... There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. My question is very short.
It's you went back on mute because your question was so very short.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was wondering if there is a proportion between the number of members of the group and the number of board members that's supposed to be in place. For example,
you're
I give my own example.
Mm-hmm.
My group is about 70 people. Most of them do have other members of the family because the purpose is to build a housing project. Right now, we only have 5 members on the board, which I'm not very active, by the way, but I wonder if it is a proportion that we should aim to.
I think that you should guide yourself based on 2 factors. 1, are you accurately representing the community in question? And 2, do you have the capacity on the board to accomplish the work that it needs to do? So I gave 2 examples myself when I was talking earlier. One of them was of a small focused organization that was really dealing only with one particular building and maybe could get away with a smaller board. And another, it was of, a large diverse organization that for a large community in the city that was looking for several housing projects and that was still in the process of articulating the community's position. We will probably need many more board members, like 15 or 18. So I do think that those criteria are the best guide to use in terms of the number, but in your situation, it feels like the question then that I would ask myself is there a lot of diversity amongst your 70 members? Do they have a broad diversity of perspectives? Or if you got all 70 of those members in a room every 3 months to let them know what the board's been doing, would they almost entirely agree with what you've done? If the goals and interests are pretty narrow,
they are sort of agreeing with everything that the small advances that we have right now. But the thing is, I wonder if we need, based on what you have said, I wonder if we should be many more people on the board, and maybe things will be better. I don't know. There's only 5.
I find 5 to be a pretty small number. I would like to see it to be, at least 7. And again, as you say, if there's a diversity of opinions, I'd like to see it a bit more than that, more like 9 or 11.
not not much diversity in opinions, but
Mhm.
we are diverse. It's Latin American.
Good. Excellent. Okay, I will mosey on here because we still have sort of two main topics yet, and I've been going on. So the first thing a new board has to do, of course, is appoint its officers. You know, you need to have at least a chair, secretary, and a treasurer.
Yeah, we do.
The education about these roles is important. So we have governance resources as well, CNCLT does. I have a great slide deck on the role of board members as well, so you can reach out. But CNCLT has access to that too, so you should probably be getting basically the same information that way. And each has certain functions to have to happen. You know, it's really good to consider a board orientation session for all of the new board members. It's really nice to, people feel quite supported if you bore them for an hour and a half on the details of governance. Trust me. Signing authorities for the bank accounts need to be updated, and of course you have corporate returns that you'll have to make with new board members are elected as well. It is important to keep on top of these things. They seem like they're relatively small, but you can quickly get yourself into a position. Say, for instance, you lose two of the people who used to be signing authorities at your bank because they moved. And now you need to add the new signing authorities, but the corporate return doesn't match your current board members. Then you can't do that at the bank until you get your corporate return updated, which can take a couple of days. So the whole process stretches out to a week and like 7 different trips by different individuals doing all the things they need to do. Whereas if you just keep on top of it from the outset, it's much easier to accomplish. You need to determine how many, how your board meetings will be run, whether they'll be by consensus or by majority votes. And consider using a consent agenda mechanism. I think I have a slide on that here in a moment. And if I don't, I'll mention it again because it is a really important aspect of making your early board meetings a bit easier. And also you have to determine a board meeting schedule. So things work, of course, in terms of consent and awareness on a board. So the organization does have an obligation to be clear with board members when the regular board meetings are. So that's why it's very important at your first board meeting to actually set what that schedule will be, whether it's going to be every third Thursday in the evening or what, whether it's going to be 10 board meetings a year or 12, however you're going to sort it out. It's important that basically after the first board meeting, board members go home knowing sort of what the expectation is on them. Otherwise, if you have board meetings outside of that, you've got quite heavy duty notification constraints where you have to do quite a bit of work to actually formally inform board members that an extraordinary board meeting is going to happen. Oh, consent agenda. So some organizations use consent agendas to make board meetings significantly more efficient. It's a very useful consensus-based mechanism that helps you approve non-controversial items very quickly. So things like approving minutes, minor policy adjustments, letters of support for community organizations, or approval of small regular contracts. All of these things that or you very strongly expect board members aren't really going to have any questions about, but you do still need to formally have their approval. The consent agenda mechanism works because you can't approve these things without the unanimous support of the process. So any board member has the right to unilaterally, just because they want to, ask that a particular item can be removed from the consent agenda and discussed and decided separately. And because any board member has that unilateral right, just the fact that no one exercises that right during the process of approving the consent agenda provides their implicit support for those things. So again, because of the unanimity of the process, you can exploit this in order to make quicker and easier decisions. So definitely consider it. It can easily shave 20 minutes off basically every board meeting you have. So required committees. It's important to set up committees. particularly, like the interim board should have set up some committees to ensure that all the work that it needs to do as an operational board happens. However, the new board, those committees will be set up with a goal of actually getting work done. Like you're considering negotiating to buy that plot of land that you hope to build a building on or whatever. Once you have your elected board, you should set up the proper sort of long-term committees. Governance committee, to draft and recommend policies to the board, and to ensure that a nominations committee is in place, a finance committee to provide oversight for the bookkeeper and staff when it comes to budgeting and spending, and an executive committee that has delegated authority from the board to make certain operational decisions in emergencies, and to act as the manager for the executive director when you hire one. So those types of things, it's important to have those committees in place early. Optional committees, you can also have a resource development committee that seeks funding or fundraising opportunities or supports grant applications. The HR committee, you might not need it at very first if you're really only going to have an ED for the first year or 18 months. But at some point you'll need oversight and support for hiring and staff relations. And an acquisition or project committee. So this would be a committee that supports the acquisition of new properties or the oversight of the Land Trust's main project. So they're all really good committees to have in place. Policies. A new board also, you do have to transition to a policy board because operational boards are not, you're too in the weeds and you're not really doing what volunteers are supposed to be doing. You're doing the work that staff is supposed to be doing. And it's a great, very authentic way to support an organization to sort of do staff work as a volunteer at the beginning when it has to be that way. But you really should transition out of that as quickly as possible. The role of a board member is oversight. It's not actually doing things. It's making certain that the context is created so that the way things are done meets the mission, vision, and values of the organization. So you really should have, I say required over here, meaning I very strongly recommend them. Legally, you're not required to have any of these policies, although some jurisdictions will require you to have a disability policy or an anti-discrimination policy. Ultimately, you'll have to have a workplace safety policy in most jurisdictions as well. But here, I think for good governance, you really do have to have a hiring policy because that can be a really messy area at times, especially in initiatives like ours, where it's very common for the first ED to be someone who's sort of been involved on the project as a volunteer for a long time. And so you have to be very transparent about those decisions. And it's hard to be transparent if you don't have a policy in place that you're being transparent with respect to. An HR policy, once you have more staff than the ED, it's very important to have an HR policy in place to help contextualize the executive director's hiring and staff management activities. Purchasing policy also is very important to have as the board delegates more authority to staff in order to actually spend money. That has to happen in the context of a purchasing policy to ensure that your responsibility to provide oversight of the finances for the membership is in fact something you can accomplish. A nomination policy, as I mentioned earlier, very, very important part of a healthy organization is having a nomination policy that clearly sets out how new board members are found and exactly how they're chosen. And as I said before, I strongly, strongly recommend that the nominations policy make it clear, if not the bylaws themselves, make it clear that a nomination committee be comprised of people who are not currently board members. Disability accommodation policy, again, it is one of the main tools for providing support to economically marginalized board and committee members. And it's just a really good thing to have because it's a great place to articulate the values of the organization. Recommended policies from a governance perspective, and anti-discrimination policy is really a key thing to have to make certain that, again, everyone knows and understands where your organization lies in terms of those those issues. Workplace safety policy, again, is very important. And financial control policies, at some point, if you become large enough, a purchasing policy only covers how you spend money, but you might, for instance, the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust oversees 81 homes, and it does so, it's receiving many tens of millions of dollars of funding in order to bring those homes into a state of good repair. That means that there are times when with quite a large amount of money in our bank account that we're not actually spending. Well, what are the processes in place that are going to ensure that that money is well managed in the interest of members and isn't held in accounts in some kind of wasteful way? That would be a financial control policy. I'm just going to check quickly here on the chat before I move on to the next stage. Yeah, CNCLT has, I think I've given them most of sort of my policy templates, so you can ask for them. And if there's one that you don't see, you're welcome to reach out through them to me, and I'll find something for you. So moving away from executive committees is like you need to, at the end of the day, your three offices, the executive committee is kind of a container for your secretary, treasurer, and chair/president and vice chair/vice president. I think it is ultimately the feature that has to be held onto is that those particular officers do have to understand and have a container to meet regularly in order to accomplish their job, which is to provide managerial oversight for the ED, and to set the agenda for monthly board meetings, or to determine if an emergency board meeting is necessary. So that function still has to happen. It can happen over email, like someone can propose an agenda for next month's board meeting. Like usually the executive director will propose an agenda for the next board meeting because that's the person who knows sort of what's going on the ground. But it's very, to be clear, it's the authority of the chair or the vice chair, if the vice chair is acting on behalf of the chair, to set the agenda for the board meeting, but with the advice of both staff and the other officers. So that usually means a discussion, and that usually means a meeting. That meeting is also the place where the managerial oversight for the executive director takes place. And it's those people meeting that determines whether an emergency board meeting happens. So I still think it's easiest just to call those executive committee meetings. And if you're calling them executive committee meetings, you might as well just call it a committee. But you're right in that there's, other than those actions, which all adhere to the officer roles, you don't formally need to have an executive committee. I hope that was clear. Okay, hiring staff. So this is the last section, and I have 11 minutes, so we will get through it, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. I can stay for a little while after if there are extra questions. So the new board must also begin the process of hiring staff, securing funding, of course, and to determine a provisional staffing budget based on likely funding scenarios. So you probably will, the initial board will have a sense of what the likely planning is, whether you're going to be applying for funding from some foundation or from CMHC, or whether you're going to try a community bond plan, or however your funding is likely going to look. The first elected board will then have to start fleshing out that plan, and based on how that plan is fleshed out, start to budget the amount of money that's available for staffing. And then based on that, you create a provisional org chart and develop just very draft job descriptions at this point that are all consistent with your likely funding. And then once your funding is secure, ultimately there's a balance of have they signed off on your funding? How likely is it? You can go so far, only so far down the path. Obviously, you can't actually sign on the executive director until you have secured your funding, unless you're very, very clear about that, even at the job posting level. So you might want to hire someone to help finish the business plan in order to secure the funding, that's fine, but you have to be very clear that securing funding for the position will be part of the role that you're hiring for. You can't allow it to be implicitly assumed that you have funding to support full-time employment unless you actually do. Once funding is secured, you have a clear plan, you have a timeline for hiring your executive director and possibly other staff. Optionally, you should seek community and member feedback on the proposed organizational chart and job descriptions. This is another example of one of those times when it doesn't hurt at all to just have more eyes on these documents. They're ultimately public anyways, because they're going to end up going out in job postings. It doesn't hurt at all to let as many members as possible just have a look at them and maybe come up with some cool idea. And then, the first person you actually hire will be the executive director, and then you'll support the ED. The hiring committee will support the ED in hiring the remaining of the staff. So how do you go about hiring the ED? You strike a hiring committee. And the hiring committee will finalize and recommend for approval the ED job description, and then actually create and circulate the job posting based on that job description. And then you go through the same process as everyone else. You filter and prioritize the resumes and schedule the interviews. Usually at least 2 rounds of interviews for senior positions. And then you recommend a ranking of the applicants and propose salary ranges to the board for approval. Some organizations try and delegate the process entirely to the hiring committee, but I don't recommend it. They're very, very this decision will have a very large impact. Hiring the ED will have a very large impact on the tone of the organization going forward. And ultimately, it's the entire board who has that relationship. And so you should respect the entire board's right to articulate its interests in making that decision. And then, it's the ranking and salary ranges that are approved by the board. Because of course you won't know until your first choice actually accepts your offer, and that they will accept their offer. So it can be really rough to then, as you're desperate to finish the process, go back to the board to get the board's approval to go with the second choice. So you should be asking the board to approve the ranking of applicants that the hiring committee feels are appropriate, and the salary ranges that are approved for them, so that the hiring committee can then proceed to negotiate with the successful applicants within those constraints. And then hiring the other staff. So once the ED has been hired, you really should, this is a very, very key inflection point in the transition from being an operational board to being a policy board. It can feel a little bit hard to let your baby go, but as soon as you have hired that ED, you really should afford them as much input as possible into the remaining staffing decisions. They should then go back with the ED, go back to the org chart and the remaining job descriptions to flesh them out more. The ED may have input about changes to the org chart, changes to job descriptions. The hiring committee should support the ED where possible, without letting go of your obligation to keep the members' interests at heart, of course. But it is in the members' interest to have a vibrant, competent ED who doesn't feel that the board is micromanaging them. Support the ED with the filtering and prioritizing of the resumes, and also support the ED with the subsequent interviews. The ED should probably be part of each of those subsequent interviews, but it'd be really great to have 1 or 2 hiring committee members supporting them. For staff reporting directly to the ED, the hiring committee should, with the ED's input, recommend successful candidates to the board for approval. For staff that don't report directly to the ED, really you should, at that point, it's not really the board's, the board should have faith in the choices that they've made in hiring the staff that they've hired, all the ones that will be reporting directly to the ED and the ED themselves. below that point, it's really just the board's fingers being in a pie that it doesn't need to be in for the board to continue to have input in that process. So you can just sort of let that all be determined by the ED. Of course, the ED will be required to stay within the confines of whatever budget has been approved, and whatever that process might be. So ED can't just hire someone without authority to hire someone from the board, but once the authority to hire has been provided, the choice should be left to the ED. There you go. And then here we are. This is it. You've gotten to the end of the road. Don't micromanage. Trust the ED that you've hired. You should definitely revert to a policy review, supporting the ED's decisions when asked, dealing with emergencies, authorizing significant organizational decisions, and of course, doing your best to support partnership relationships with other organizations in the community. And then I think that's it. Succession planning, yes, anything can happen, so be prepared. You've just hired a brand new ED, and so the expectation, of course, is that they're going to be with you for a long time. But new jobs can produce a lot of stress for people. Accidents happen. The worst thing is just not to have anything in place at all for an emergency that arises. One of the things that a lot of organizations don't recognize is that some directors and officers insurance policies will provide financial supports in case of the sudden loss of a critical staff person. So that'll depend on the size of your organization, but eventually the umbrella will extend, to like a CFO as well, or COO. So it's good to keep that in mind as you're choosing directors and officers insurance policy, because it is really important to make certain that you have the supports in place to recover quickly if you have major problems with your ED. And then conflict management. I have touched on this a couple times, but you do have to be prepared for it. It's important to have a clear conflict resolution process in place that provides guidance for conflicts between staff members, board members, and volunteers. As if you can make the process as relatively distinct from the various roles, recognizing sort of the implicit representational quality of individual roles, and the implicit privileges that different people have, like staff have an obligation to do the work they're doing, and they can't not do the work. Whereas a committee member can decide not to go to a committee meeting if they're having a personality conflict with someone who's there. A staff person can't. If a staff person's having a personality conflict with a member or volunteer, they can't recede from that as easily. So those types of factors should be reflected in the conflict resolution policy. But otherwise, you should try and make the policy as generic as possible in terms of the different ways that conflict can arise, and as supportive as possible and non-judgmental as possible in terms of how the conflict is resolved. If you don't have a conflict resolution process in place, conflict can rapidly expand, because different people have different understandings of what is fair. And the very first thing that people do if they sense that something unfair is happening is they go and talk to other people about it. And before you know it, what might have been even just a really jarring misunderstanding between people has turned into a lot of community-based conflict. So it is important to make certain you have your eye on that ball as well. A healthy board forever. Ensuring a diverse stream of potential new board members is crucial. So as I said before, it is hard to do this work, but an insular board-driven nomination process that results in friends of friends and not very much diversity it leads to problems. We recently had a very huge blow up here in Ontario with a credit union that really got way on the other side of the tracks in terms of legal oversight. Ultimately, that situation was only able to arise because there was a very insular nomination process. So a fully independent nomination committee, you've heard me say it 3 times, I won't say it a 4th, but at least I think it's really important. There you go, that's everything. Does anyone have any questions? Again, I hope CNCLT does. I have one. If they don't, I'll pass it along. Any other questions? Look at that, right on time.
Great. Well, thanks so much, James. And yeah, good job on that sharp timing. I hope folks found this useful. It was a lot of really great information, and we're super lucky to learn from someone with so much experience in the field. So